right, it's our great pleasure to, for this very final last session, to welcome Professor Seri Plokhy, the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, and very prolific author, who will be discussing what I thought until a few minutes ago was his latest book, but it turns out he's got another one. He's already lined up for Danyliw 2017. So. Before we begin the session that will be moderated by Mayhill, I want to say a few words about Professor Orest Subtelny, who passed away this summer, actually born in 41, still, a little off by 2 years. Professor Subtelny was well known York University, University of Toronto, in Toronto, and became famous, so to speak, in the field with the publication in the late 1980s of A History of Ukraine, which I believe is the title of the book, right? The History of Ukraine. So in the last several decades, that became like the first major and very influential survey of Ukrainian history. The publication coincided almost, like it came out in the late 80s, and then of course the Soviet Union opened up and then collapsed, and his book was published in early 1990s in Ukrainian and through very wide circulation. So we thought that in discussing Serhi's book, The Gates of Europe, which is the third major survey of history in, again, the last several decades, the second being the book by Professor Magoshi, which was published around 1996. History of Ukraine. I can't remember, never heard
Ukraine, people and cultures.
Something like that. But these are, The Gates of Europe is
Lands
the third
people.
major history of Ukraine. So we thought that the panel would be kind of dedicated in memory of Professor Subtelny, like looking back in terms of, and then looking forward in terms of the evolution or the development of the field of writing Ukrainian history. I can add maybe on a personal note that we've been talking about summer schools here, and we have alumni of summer schools at the Danyliw seminar. I used to go to summer school as a student. That was my introduction to Ukraine. In 1990, the first summer school, whose director was Ihor Ostash, later on ambassador of Ukraine to Canada. In 1991, the second summer school, very memorable one. Professor Subtelny was one of the faculties. That's where I met him. I didn't meet him in Canada, actually. I met him in Kyiv. So he played also a formative role in my own development. So without further ado, I'll leave it to Mayhill
Great.
to moderate the panel.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dominique. It's a great pleasure to have Professor Seri Plokhy here for the Danyliw seminar. He's not only the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, but also the Mikhailo Hrushevsky Chair of Ukrainian History at Harvard, and is, I think, uniquely qualified to write a history of Ukraine. His books do fill a bookshelf. He's written about Mikhailo Hrushevsky, he's written about Cossacks, he's written about Imperial history, Soviet history. His sort of before the last book was called The Last Empire, about the collapse of the Soviet Union. So he's really well placed to write, an expert in all, in the entire periodic chronology of what can be perceived as Ukrainian history. And I want to start talking about this idea of grand narratives of Ukraine. Subtelny's book, which came out I think in '88, Magochy's book, which came out in the mid-'90s, are very different. Subtelny sort of uses this organizing category of Ukrainians, right? Sort of the story of the Ukrainian people, and Magochy very much this idea of sort of territory, the different peoples living on this territory. And so I'm wondering what inspired you to take on this grand narrative and write another grand narrative of Ukraine. And specifically in the beginning of your grand narrative, The Gates of Europe, you talk about how it was actually Maidan and the crisis in Ukraine that sort of compelled you to want to take on this challenge. So can you speak a little bit about that? There should be another microphone.
Okay. Yeah, you can hear me. Great, thanks. Well, thanks for the questions, thanks for the introduction, and it's really my great pleasure to be here. I heard a lot about the Danyliw seminar. I knew some people who participated in it. They were coming up with just this excitement, energy that I thought, wow, it's really wonderful event, and I'm happy that finally I'm here, just not following on Facebook or Twitter or something like that. But I'm here, and again, those two panels that I attended, that I heard, they were really very good. So it's my pleasure to be here. In terms of what kind of inspired me to write The Gates of Europe, first of all, I want to give a qualification regarding grand narrative. Mine is not as grand as theirs. Theirs is at least 800, 900 pages
right,
long.
This is 350, yeah.
Right, and mine is 350, so it's at least half of well, when it comes to the grand part of the narrative. But generally, we spent in the field of Ukrainian history most of the last 20 years, both outside of Ukraine, but also in Ukraine as well, doing everything possible to prove to ourselves and the world that grand narratives are impossible, that this is passé. Hrushevsky was 19th century, it was 10 volumes. Then it was reduced to a mere 1,000 pages in Magochi, and probably even that the world move on, and it's impossible to do things like that. And there were two things that kind of forced me to think differently about that. One of them was, and they were happening around, more or less around the same time. So one is Maidan. Another one was, I was in Ukraine and checking my email, and then someone sent to me a letter signed by, it seems to me, 3 historians. One of them happened to be my own chair at Harvard, David Armitage, who was saying something like that, well, we really retreated as historians. We kind of abandoned the public field. We retreated in our narrow disciplines and allowed anybody else to write these things that are called or were called grand narratives. And the niches field, of course, and we neglected on our responsibility, and it's our task to do that. So that provides some kind of intellectual legitimacy for me, at least. I was thinking about that, but now I thought, okay, maybe I'm not the only one who is thinking in those terms. And the second one was, of course, the events in Ukraine, and what happened was that once in a sudden, no one knew about Ukrainian history or Ukraine, and now I had, I don't know, per day maybe 3 or 4 or 5 requests to go there to talk to, again, probably many or some of you experienced the same situation. So Ukraine was there in the news, and you can't respond to all those requests, and other people respond, and you hear a lot of things that really just are revolting on different levels, not just in terms of the position that is being taken or conscious abuse of history, but just not knowing what people are talking about. And there was a need just to go out there and educate to the best kind of what the way how you can do that. And those two things actually came together and almost forced me to write this book. There was also one kind of concern that I had to deal with. part of that book, less than I thought originally, but when I started to write it, is based on my lectures. And I thought, do I really need to publish a book and then go and rewrite my lectures? Maybe I'll wait until retirement, and then on the first day after retirement, I'll put that together and publish as a book. So there were those concerns as well, but eventually the extremely low level of discussion on Ukraine in the American media was the one that convinced me that that would be a good thing to do. Now returning to probably even more interesting question about the two narratives, grand narratives that are there for the last 25 years. And again, I agree with Michael, with your qualification of those books in terms of their central central approach, with looking mostly at the Ukrainian people / nation as they move in history, and then history of the land and its people, which is reflected in the title of Magwitch's book. So these are different approaches: people versus territory, and the idea was, okay, should I take any position there? First of all, there is a degree of oversimplification, of course, in both of these approaches. You look at Subtelny, and it's not like you don't see there non-Ukrainians. They're there. Like they're there in Hrushevsky. Yeah. So that's one thing. Another thing, you look at Magwitch, okay, yes, there are sections and there are parts, and on the Crimean Tatars in the last publication it was increased. But what is holding all this together? Who is the main actor still? That would be the ethnic Ukrainian majority as it moves through different stages in its mobilization. So there was a lot of oversimplification, despite the fact that I agree with basic assessments of those books. Well, I thought that basically I wasn't interested in that because I found problems with just putting one book or another in one niche or another. And I, in my research, tried to do a couple of things. And one of them was to take what we learned about Ukrainian history for the last 20 and 25 years, after the independence of 1991, what we learned in our debates about either people first or territory first, what we learned through our retreat into this kind of idea that the grand narratives are impossible, and try to come back and bring that back into the subject that is called Ukrainian history. And probably we'll get to that later. We just published a wonderful collection of essays and Michal's essays there from the conference that we had a few years ago. The title of the collection is The Future of the Past, and I was lucky to write also an introduction there. And I conclude that introduction saying that, well, there are interesting things happening in the field of imperial history, and the historians working on empires are saying that, well, the history of empires dominated world for a long period of time, then they were rejected. Hrushevsky was an important part of that revolution, and Subtelny. The nations took the center stage, and they're saying, well, now it's the time to write a new history of empires, a new imperial history. And I finish my introduction, which was probably very much I'm trying to justify what I already did, with putting this question about the need for new national history. Not ethnocentered, but a new national history, because at the end of the day, that's what the publisher wanted, that's what the readers wanted, and then to my major shock, that's what a publisher in Ukraine wanted, because I didn't think that anyone will be interested in my history in Ukraine. Ukraine has a lot of histories of Ukraine. That's what they wanted as well, and again, I think it's also partly our responsibility as a historians, as a professionals, political scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, also go there and raise the level of the debate. So I will stop here.
Great. Thank you so much. I love that idea of sort of the call of the public intellectual to leave the ivory tower, right? To really kind of engage with seeing the low level of discourse, particularly on Ukrainian history. I think for historians it was very hard to read some sort of basic mistakes and misunderstandings about the history of Ukraine in a lot of the Western press. And I think, if I were to, you're saying that makes me understand something about this book, which is I think it's organized very much around myths and debates in a way. So you had this myth of Kievan Rus. What is that? Vikings. What's going on there? East and Western Christianity. Why is this important? The Khmelnytsky riots. What's the story there? And kind of taking these sort of little flashpoint moments and moments, I think, where people do misunderstand, right? And it seems like you're kind of trying to work through these different moments of misunderstanding and sort of using that in a way as an organizational framework for the book. I don't know if my reading makes sense.
Well, it does, but it's scary because I thought that you can't tell that by reading the book, and it looks like you got it. I write in the introduction something that basically is absolutely taboo in the profession. We all in the history departments rebel against the thing called presentism. Presentism, which means basically you take our today's sensitivities and, I don't know, we discussed some gender roles, and you go into the 19th century or 11th century and try to judge 19th century history by our understanding of what the gender roles should be in the army or something like that. So that's in a nutshell presentism. And we all want to go there into the depth of the 15th century and try to figure out what is not important for us, what was important for those people, and ask questions that would be important for them. And because I have tenure already, I decided that I can engage in the act of hooliganism and say, okay, this is a presentist book. I don't care about people in the 13th century. I care about the questions that we ask now.
Right.
And I will write the history of the 13th and 14th century in the way that answers the questions that we have today, which is a sacrilege, which is bad thing to do. Again, it's only tenure, I guess, that saved me. But that was also this and when I explained that to someone, my colleague looked at me and said, well, isn't that the way how we write history anyway? But at least I went there and publicly admitted that that is what I'm doing. And just to continue, another challenge was there are allegedly 2,500 years of history. So how in the world you link that and make that coherent, and what are the questions that would unite that and would make it maybe not grand, there is not so many pages, but still a narrative. And the way how I'm trying to solve that is going not exactly outside of the subtelny Magochi debate. I am certainly very much learned from both books and from debate per se, but put in a different framework. And this framework is about culture.
Yeah.
And culture was also very helpful in a sense to understand how changes are happening, and culture is what is important for us as well. Identity is another thing that we are, for whatever reason, are very much interested in and tend to explain a lot of things through identities. Again, that's what also was interested for me in history of Kievan Rus, for example. Not answering the classic Hrushevsky question whether they were Russians or Ukrainians, but asking the question, who the heck did they think they were? And again, very much that was informed by our interest in that question. So, and that's where my interest in people of the 11th century and our coincided. So sometimes it happened.
Can you talk a little bit more about that culture angle? I was very struck that you say I'm not going through political institutions. I'm really interested in geography and culture. And so how are you defining culture? What do you mean by culture?
Well, it's a difficult question, and I was very pragmatic in terms of my definition of culture. I never provided it, but
I know.
That's part of being careful, but then I declared it. So and for me, culture is in the center of my understanding and trying to make sense out of Ukrainian history. I look at Ukraine being a product of two frontiers, which are basically cultural frontiers. And one of them is, we talk about that endlessly East-West divide, Eastern Christianity, Western Christianity. Another is, which is not entirely new, but certainly is new for the way of framing Ukrainian history, is this north-south divide with the settled areas versus the steppe areas. And this cultural frontiers, they come with a lot of things that can be qualified and classified as culture on different levels, from the church institutions to the tradition of relations between church and state, to the political culture that associated, let's say, with contract relationship in Western culture, to the steppe politics. Whatever cultural elements those two frontiers, as they were moving, were bringing, and I embraced as my culture, as my understanding of culture. And then another big thing that came really for me in terms of thinking about that with events in Donbass was this whole idea of regionalism and regions. And it was there, but if you are a good Ukrainian patriot, you were there for the last 25 years saying that, okay, regions don't matter. You take an inspiration from Slavko Hrycak's article about Lviv and Donbass growing closer and closer, and this is the matter of the past, and this is not important, and so on and so forth. And one thing that we learned, not exactly learned, we kind of knew that, but now we were compelled to talk about that on a different level. In the last 2 or 3 years were regions, and the question for me was, okay, wonderful, these two borders moving, where do the regions fit or don't fit into that? And again, for me, it's as borders move, they move not just sometimes very slowly, sometimes as a result of things like Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or the first annexation of the Crimea of 1783. And they create different cultural spaces. So it's the imperial borders, it's the state borders, it's the church borders that are moving and creating those spaces. And some rulers, by moving state borders, also trying to change the cultural and religious borders. Union of Lublin and the Union of Brest. Joseph Stalin appears there in 1935, and he eliminates the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, moving cultural border, institutional cultural border to the west, and so on and so forth. So that's for me, those were explanations of how history of the state, history of the institutions, and history of culture work together, and how Ukraine is a result of this moving cultural frontiers.
Yeah, great. I love how you just mentioned the Union of Brest and Joseph Stalin in one sentence. Those are like 400 years apart. And one very striking thing about the Gates of Europe is, I think it's maybe this is because I specialize in the 20th century, but it seems like it's emphasis on the early modern period. And you spend a long time on a lot of sort of flashpoints and debates from the early modern period, and a lot of time talking about the differences in church cultures and the 16th century and the 17th century and the 18th century, and really going into a lot of detail on that. And I wonder if in any way that's because you might see an importance in that early modern period in how we see Ukraine today, that we can't just understand what's happening in Ukraine from just the Soviet period, right? That we actually, we do need to look further back to the 16th century.
Well, on a very practical level, you write what you know, what you think you know. And for me, coming from the I started as early modernist, so that was a relatively easy choice to write about those things in some detail. Again, if you look at the chapters, if you look at pages and things like that, early modernists probably would expel me from the guild, because in terms of you count years and you count pages, and there is clear this presentist bias, so the 20th century gets the bulk of what is in the book. So in that sense, I kind of almost guilty that I didn't pay enough attention to that period. But you're absolutely right in a sense that I think that the Union of Brest is much more important for understanding today's Ukrainian history than certain things that were happening maybe 25 years.
Why is that?
Or 40 years. Because the same approach of the culture and this turning point in culture. Because that's also the period when this Western frontier is moving. But even more importantly for me, two of my areas of expertise, early expertise, the struggles over the church union and the Cossacks. Mm-hmm. They are for me embodiment of the, it's not like Gates of Europe, the course that I'm teaching, Frontiers of Europe and so on and so forth. It's not Ukraine just a playground where different cultures and emperors and things like that come and fight their battles. This borderland situation, cultural situation in the first place, it creates a particular type of society. And the Cossacks for me is basically an embodiment of the society that is born on the frontier, on that Christian-Muslim frontier, on the frontier of the settled and colonized territories. That's a particular Ukrainian, again, not just Ukrainian phenomenon, Russian as well. This is a frontier, the phenomenon of the frontier, but in Ukrainian context, these guys create a state of their own, which is absolutely unbelievable. There are very good reasons to compare them, let's say, with the pirates of Mediterranean or Caribbean or something like that. Yeah. But none of them created the state. Those guys did that. The union is the same. It's an institution between East and West. Yeah. It's for me a symbol and embodiment of what the Ukrainian society is about. And I don't know whether I was able to show that in the book, but that was my ambition, and I declared it, that I read the Ukrainian society as the society that is there, still there, after this 2 or 3 years, because of this inherited ability to live in multicultural spaces and negotiate identities and go across the borders that this cultural spaces create. If that ability wouldn't be there, well, we would talk today probably like Slavko was saying about 2 Ukraines, sorry, it was not Slavko. Slavko was saying 22. Yes, Repchuk. We would be talking today about 2 Ukraine, and only one of them would be Ukraine.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Maybe you were unfaithful to the early modernists, but also World War II only has 1 chapter in the book, and certainly for this seminar, we have so many papers about World War II. I mean, we're very World War II focused, and it's one small chapter in the book. And I'm wondering, what were the tough choices that you made for things that you couldn't put in?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I sneaked in 2 chapters on the war, and that one of them is called Hitler's Lebensraum.
Yeah.
Another is called The Victors or something like that.
The one right after the
Right,
war.
the one after it, and I sneaked part of it also in the Stalin's Fortress. So, but that's again, you write and you think about those phenomena and you try to put them into the same section, and then this section has to be at least somehow in terms of the size correspond to other, and you really can do that. And I found that when I am offering this course, so I'm planning a revolution for one class and Second World War also for one class, and they never actually able to do that.
Yeah.
So, and here I decided to create different chapters. The question was how you do that, how you divide that, and in my case, I talk about the origins of the World War II, and Ukraine is there at the very beginning with Transcarpathia, with the partitioning of Czechoslovakia. So it's in the World War II even before World War II is there. And then there is the history of the German occupation,
right,
which constitutes a separate chapter. And then there is the chapter on the post-Stalingrad history.
Right.
So again, I tried, I didn't manage to put it into one chapter, but that's somewhat arbitrarily choices, but again, they're there. And they're there because of the explosion of what you mentioned, because of the explosion of the research on the Second World War, because of the explosion of the research that goes beyond what probably we would be writing before '91 about the war, which would be still very much focused, if not on Marshal Zhukov, then on just on Marshal Paulus or something, Field Marshal Paulus or something like that. The amount of research on the occupation, on people under occupation, what is going on there, attention to the partisans on all sides of the divide. So it's abundance of literature and very good literature. So World War II in Ukraine probably is covered more than any other part of the 20th century history, and you can forget, of course, about poor 19th century, 18th century,
right,
which gets very little attention.
Right. Well, I mean, I think actually that's one of the strengths of the book, though, is that yes, you're synthesizing the material on World War II, which has become kind of its own field, right? But that you do include so much about the early modern period, right? That most of us who study the 20th century really don't pay that much attention to. So I think sort of changing the lens and the emphasis in the narrative on what's important in the history of Ukraine is a step in a positive direction.
Thank you.
But I want to push you again. What were tough choices that you made in the book? What were things that you had to leave out, and why?
Well,
or something you had to put in and you didn't want to.
Let me think about that. Well, the toughest was when the editor then told me that for book to sell it has to be, well, she didn't tell me, I kind of knew that, but she has to be under $30 American. To be under $30 American, it can't be over a certain amount of pages. So if I wanted to influence the debate and people whom I hate to see on TV, I had to cut it, and those were difficult choices, and the entire chapter went from my beloved 17th century, and
right,
it's not there. It is gone. The 19th century took a cut as well, and in the 20th century, actually, most of what was there, what was written, actually stayed. But when I was writing, of course, You mentioned that I did a couple of monographic studies before that,
Yes.
and Hrushevsky was one of them, and then I wrote on Yalta.
Yalta,
So I wanted to write more on that,
Right.
and I couldn't. And then the question was, do I really do justice to history of Ukraine, to this narrative and things like that, by missing a lot? One of the criticisms that I heard, which is very, very well-founded criticism, is that, for example, well, I heard a lot of criticism, so some of them, mostly about things that I didn't include. I was working on the in the 1920s, the history of the Ukrainian autocephalous church. It is not there. It is not there. I worked on Hrushevsky. I knew his relations with Franco and so on and so forth. Franco is there, but really as a secondary figure and of secondary importance. People attack me. Why Franco got just a couple of pages, and someone like Yusufovich got 2 or 3 paragraphs? Well, at the end, when you try to pack 2,500 years of history, you have to just look at the certain trends, and you have to pick figures who would represent those trends. And Yusufovich was very important because he represented this little Russian trend of the 19th century, which is very important for understanding not just 19th century Ukraine, but today's Ukraine. And Galicia and developments in Galicia were extremely and very important for the sake of Galician history, but also Ukrainian as well. And there Hrushevsky served as this symbol that would unite these two processes that happening at the same time. Franco could serve as a good symbol as well. Again, I had to make those choices. So there are some good and important people that are not there, institutions that are not mentioned. My hope is that still I did a good job in terms of showing the trends, and particularly the trends that are important for our understanding of where we are coming from.
Yeah. You also go very much up to the present, right? So speaking of presentism, I mean, as you were writing this book, things were changing every day in Ukraine, right? So how did what was happening in Ukraine change how you wrote the book, particularly as we moved into the war in Donbass? I mean, how did that manifest itself in the narrative that you were writing?
Well, the broader impact, of course, was, okay, that I decided that maybe national history per se is not entirely dead. We just have to rethink it and redefine it. That was the major impact. The importance of the region is another impact. Identity, probably I would write about identity and culture anyway. That was there in terms of my interest before that. But very challenging turned out to be the last chapter and a half, when I'm writing about very recent developments. So the book appeared in December of the last year. So it went to print. It takes 1 year for them to produce the book. So there was editing and things like that. So when I was writing those chapters, I was really like Nestor Litopisец, Nestor Chronicler or something like that. There was nothing, if with the rest it's just tons of literature and it's a synthesis. There allegedly you lived through the trauma of all these events. But then you go and you start with the basics. When no one did that before, you try to establish chronology of events. Right. And then when you establish the chronology, that's how, oh my gosh, you lived through that, but you didn't realize. You live in the moment, and now you see perspective, even of a few months, which somehow give a new understanding and new meaning to those things. And then, of course, relying on the newspapers and things like that, it's a danger of getting things wrong. And I was trying to be as conservative as I could, and I managed to commit a couple of mistakes on those things. Again, I still can reference where I took that from. But as a historian, again, I know that you have to do better, you have to compare, you have to think. When you write about really current developments, you are very much at mercy of what is out there. And in the paperback, there will be some changes in general, but also some changes to the contemporary events now. First of all, much more appeared. There are discussions, there are debates, but again, at that point, I felt like, and it was really scary. You start with putting together a chronology and thinking that you are the first, that you are writing about that as a historian. It turned out by the time the book was out there that I wasn't the first, and others were writing and things like that. But that was a moment of this direct relation to the present that is becoming history, and it becoming history on the screen of your laptop.
Yeah. Just to change a little bit. So this is a Ukrainian studies seminar, right? An interdisciplinary seminar. What do you think the role of history as a discipline is in Ukrainian studies?
Well, you can judge from my books. I'm not a Marxist, but there is at least one saying of Marx that I think he got it right. And he said, again, I'm not sure how it sounded in German, but the idea was that there is only one science in the world, and it is history. So I, in that sense, I'm a Marxist. I think that history is the key, is the key, and you go there. You do your wonderful research. You tell us about the society that we live in. Poor Gorbachev realized that he didn't know the society in which he lived, and we know how it ended for him. So it's very important. But the moment you start thinking about contextualization, the moment you start thinking about the meaning of what you found there, I think whether you want that or not, whether you recognize that or not, it's history that you have to go to, and again, my argument would be for the history that is not just limited for the last 25 years. Let's say that Ukraine became independent,
Right.
became subject for research done by the political scientists of different, and okay, that's what we deal with. It's an intellectual argument, but this is also argument very practical. Buy my book, and that will help with your own research.
Speaking of books, so Seri Plokhy is incredibly prolific, and also right now has an edited volume that just came out, right? Last week? Just last week. Which is a collection of edited papers from this conference, which was on Wither Ukrainian history. Quo Vadis Ukrainian history. And what was so interesting about that conference is it took place literally the first few days of Maidan, right?
Actually, immediately before the Maidan.
Yeah.
It was in November, so Maidan started in late November. We were
Yeah.
that, it seems to me, in November.
There's something going on, maybe just early protests or something. There was some. It was like right there. And so one of the challenges I think for all of us revising our papers was, we'd written this thing about where we thought Ukrainian history was going, when no one really knew where Ukraine was, right, in the departments in which we taught and worked, and suddenly there was this sort of upheaval, right, and I think we all had to rethink the place of Ukraine in the world and the place of our work. What was your, you told us a little bit about your sort of the way that you pulled that volume together and this kind of rethinking imperial history, but can you talk a little bit more about that volume specifically on where Ukrainian history is going?
Well, the conference was part of three-partite event or project. I write about that in the introduction, that the idea came to do those things in the fall of 2011. That was in the wake when exactly Ukrainian history became the center stage of Ukrainian politics. You see 2010 Yushchenko departing. Both events, it seems to me, took place in January of 2010. You see the ruling of the Ukrainian court on the perpetrators in the Holodomor, and you see also the Star of the Hero of Ukraine awarded to Stepan Bandera. You see Yanukovych coming, and the court deciding on the Bandera issue. The genocide, non-genocide issue becomes treated by the presidential administration very differently. So history is there. And we had a meeting with Gennady Boryak, deputy director of the Institute of Ukrainian History in Kyiv, and decided to pull together a couple of conferences trying to figure out what is going on. And one of the conferences was on the Soviet historiography. It took place in Kyiv. Another one was on the interwar and diaspora Ukrainian historiography. It took place in Munich. And then the one about the future, which took place at Harvard. And that was the conference that, for a number of reasons, was supposed to be attended by a number of scholars from Ukraine. And there were very few of them. Yeah. So it turned out to be in the largely North American, partly European conference. So it was on the Ukrainian history really in North America and abroad. And again, that provided certain kind of a cohesiveness also to the conference. And those from Ukraine who came, they were actually very much thinking in the same terms as American or Canadian historians were thinking. So that made my task easier. And the parts in that book are organized in the way how I saw what was happening with the field here in North America. And that was very much a rebellion against a national or ethno-national paradigm. Yeah. That's what was about, and which events that followed immediately after that, as I explained, forced me or helped me to also look a little bit differently at the genre of national history. But the themes were, first of all, it was very much about writing, so this globalization turn, which is there, turning Ukrainian history into the history which is part of something bigger and larger, which I was also trying to do in this book. Yeah. Another was something that, again, this is regional history and interest in the region, and I called that section the return of the region. Yeah. So that was there as well. And then there were articles, others that were actually trying to think like Alfred Ribber's article, with which the collection starts, about what all these new trends can mean for the new type of Ukrainian history. So also very interesting was that none of the papers challenged really the concept that there should be such thing as Ukrainian history, which allowed then me at the end to say, okay, probably what is happening there is that we have to think about a new meaning of what national history is, which is not ethnocentric, which integrates and includes all this parts that are there and what is happening in the world outside of Ukrainian history. So that was. They were challenged, but then certain things worked in the favor of making that a more cohesive volume. And then my main task was actually to tell everybody, please don't rewrite your articles. Please don't rewrite your essays. We have to publish that. It's embarrassing. It was happening before the Maidan. It's this and that, and we absolutely have to do that. With one of the authors, it happened really a few weeks before we sent that to the press. So my task as the editor was, please don't rewrite, please don't rethink, please. I will explain. I explain exactly the time frame when it was happening. I failed. People still rewrote and still. But I also explained where the idea comes from, what the environment historically, culturally, ideologically was when we were doing that. So it is there. So it fits all the articles, I hope so. Those rewritten and those that state more or less the way how they were in 2013.
Great.
But again, thanks a lot for your contribution. I want to advertise the volume and say that's one of the best articles there is made these days.
Thank you. So hot off the presses, we have your latest book, which is a Cold War thriller.
Nothing can be hot in Ottawa these days. It's on the cold side. Yeah.
Okay. So you can't talk about this?
I can.
You can?
I can,
Okay.
I can.
Yes. So please do talk about the man with the poison gun.
What you see is actually cover for UK edition. The one that will be available hopefully by the end of this month here in Canada and in the US has a different image, which again I like as well. And this is book written more or less in the line that I told you before, that, well, I have a tenure. So I can try things and see what will happen. And really it's on the one level it's my attempt to somehow react to the debates that are happening in Ukraine on Ukrainian history and outside of Ukraine on Ukrainian history. And up until 2013, if you have a conference, I don't know whether that reflected also in what the Danyliw seminar was discussing. But if there would be a conference on Ukraine and Ukrainian history, that conference would be absolutely 90% of the time on nationalism, and it would be on Bandera, and it would be on the Second World War, and it would be on Volyn, and things like that. There was just nothing else. For a person who was coming from the 17th century, I was really deeply offended, and resisted this pressure that was coming from outside to write on Bandera and on nationalism and on the 20th century history. But man is weak. so
the lore is strong.
Right, and eventually I wrote my Bandera book, and it's a particular take. What encouraged me to do that was that at some point I realized that there is a trove of documents, recently declassified CIA documents, dealing with own Bandera, and also the report, the CIA report, the key element that convinced me to write that book, CIA report from 1976 on the investigation of and different theories of killing of Bandera, of Stashinsky, 1976. They were not sure what happened, which report really flew into the face of all these theories that CIA actually is hiding him, that they paid for Stashinsky, plastic surgery, that in 1976 CIA, according to that report, didn't know where he was, and they were not sure whether he was actually legitimately the person about his identity, and whether he was, that they were making some informed guess that probably he was a real thing, but they didn't know that. So, and that was interesting in its own right. And then I went from there, and did for the not for the first time in my life. I did a little bit of interviewing for the fall of the Soviet Union history, but there I did telephone interview of former head of the secret police and then police commissioner in South Africa. So there were some documents also eventually coming from the KGB archives. So I saw that there was something that I can add to that discussion. So that's the origins of the book. That's more a sign of my weakness rather than my strength.
But what's so interesting is to succumb to the World War II and Bandera story, but not in the form of a scholarly monograph, but in a really different genre. And so, what was it that made you want to write in this genre?
Well,
I mean, we all want to write spy thrillers, but you know.
At some point you get bored with the genres that you work in, and you try something else, and it's always a huge risk, right?
Yeah.
So you are only as good as your last book or your last article is, right?
That's depressing.
It is. It is. So think twice before publishing anything. So it is a risk. But on the other hand, I looked at what was there, and really they were all hallmarks for that really very appealing story for general audience, which involved again, it's not focused on Bandera. I was only half jokingly saying, well, Bandera is there basically to be killed. The focus is on the killer,
On Stashinsky. Yeah.
and we see this recruitment of someone who really is not joining out of his own volition. You see whatever is behind that, his major transformation. So it's on a certain level, this is a book about the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
the Soviet machine, the repressive machine, what it does to a human being in certain circumstances.
Yeah.
Because it ends with the phrase about describing this kind of a legend that is in the village, that apparently someone was there, apparently Stashinsky came and no one could recognize him, and he put flowers on the grave of his parents or something like that, but no one could recognize him, and it ends on the story that, well, this is a guy who is considered to be a traitor on every side that he ever been, which is also very much generally thinking about Ukrainian history of 2,500 years and thinking about these borders and frontiers and loyalties and identities and things like that is very much part of Ukrainian story over the period of time. So that's what was there, and then the genre again. I wanted to see what will happen, and the jury is still out there. We don't know what the reception will be. Maybe you will not invite me to the next seminar after that. But there was also the idea again to tell this story and to share my understanding of it with as broad audience as possible, and we'll see whether that book succeeds in doing that or not.
Great. I'd love to open it up to the group. Are there other questions for Seri Plokhy? Yeah, Anna.
Thanks a lot, Hanna Shelis, Ukraine Analytica. I would like to return back to your book that we started, The History of Ukraine. When we were writing about it, how you perceived Ukraine as the united entity, or as many of us who were studying at the high school in the 1990s, that we were usually studying as a parallel histories. Yep. Some part of the mainland, let's say, and Western, and for those who are from the South as me, in Odessa we always studied like 3 parallels, because for some periods we were definitely not the part of what we perceive as Ukraine. Your initial perception, was it the one country, or it was several parallel histories?
I paid my dues to the parallel histories by emphasizing the regions. But then there are multiple parallel histories. Unfortunately for someone put in that book, more than 3. And I was always struggling, oh my gosh, Transcarpathia is almost not there. They will kill me in Bukovina. There is so little this and that. And you go back and forth. And of course I was biased. I come from Zaporizhia. There is a lot of Zaporizhia there. But the way how this book is different from almost all of my predecessors is that if you look at wonderful books by Subtelny and Maguchi that we mentioned, and you want to see what was happening around 1860s in Dnieper, Ukraine, for the lack of a better word, or Eastern Ukraine, and in Galicia, you have to go through maybe 200 pages that they're divided. They're divided physically, they're divided by pages, they're divided in the perception. They're subjects to different historical processes. What I was trying to do in this book actually is bring these regions together, which is kind of a novel model in Ukrainian history, but for anyone who does global history, European history, history of a number of countries, it's just, it's no-brainer. You look at the process of urbanization or emancipation of serfs, or the Jewish communities, or things like that, and you look, that's the broad, the big question that historians are interested in. And in that sense, bringing Galicia and Odessa and Donbass together, it's easy and it's very productive also. You look at the common trends, but you also look at the differences that come out of these different historical trajectories. And Hughes and Donbass is there in the same sentence as the Drohobych oil, because they're one and the same. And Odessa is there because of the railways and the agricultural boom in the south. That what explains the Odessa's rise. So I was surprised that I lack proper English word, but in Ukrainian that would be як ніхто до цього раніше не додумався. So but that was my way of dealing with this multiple trajectories, but I'm afraid I failed with quite a few regions.
Right behind the young woman, right there in the scarf. No. Okay.
Professor Plokhy, thank you very much for coming today to Ottawa. Oleg Schindler. Thank you very much for coming today. Oleg Schindler, I'm a student at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. I'm wondering about one of the dimensions of Ukrainian and Russian conflict remains the war over the past, speaking about the pre-modern past. And I'm doing my research and I wanted to ask you, is it possible to find a peace settlement between Ukrainian and Russian historians on this heritage of Kievan Rus? And if it is possible, in what way? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I don't think that there is a war between Russian and Ukrainian historians studying Kievan Rus. None. There is, they agree on everything. There is a tag of war for people who don't study Kievan Rus. Over Kievan Rus. But that's a big question. And of course, the most recent monument, well, addition to the Moscow landscape with the monument to Prince Volodymyr is just one more indication of that tag of war. There are different ways, it looks like, to resolve this issue and this question of Kiev and Kievan Rus. And one of them, again, on the level of politics of memory, public perceptions, and things like that. And one of them is what I understand is happening today in Russia. And the general trend is somehow to remove Kiev from as a central part of the Russian historical narrative, the history of the genesis of Russia as Russian nation. It was put there by monks of Kiev in the 17th century. It stuck there. So now there is either more attention is paid to Novgorod, or even with Volodymyr now in the center of Moscow, the connection is to the Chersonesus and Crimea. So I don't know whether this is peace or not or armistice, but the troops are being kind of moved to different positions, which make the whole issue of Kiev less central potentially for the future Russian historical identity than it used to be. And there is a much more aggressive, on the other hand, now, especially now in Ukraine, claim for Kiev as a Ukrainian center. So in a sense that instead of kind of a shared past, there is this delimitation of the past that is happening, which from the perspective, my perspective as not, again, an expert on Kiev and Rus, but early modernist who wrote certain things on Kiev and Rus. From the academic perspective, maybe not an ideal solution, because really we are talking about shared past. And that shared past can become really shared if we just imagine for a second that there were no Russians and Ukrainians in the 11th century. That the guys who were running around had different identities, multiple, and so on and so forth. That's one of the things that I'm trying to write about in my book for academic audience, but also put into the books for broader audience, and with the hope that, okay, maybe that can change our also perception of what Kiev and Rus was. So that's how I see the current situation with Kiev and Rus.
Other questions? Yes, Ina.
We don't have much opportunity to talk at Harvard, so
Okay,
let's
if there is this opportunity,
yes.
then let's start discussion and then we can continue at home. So you mentioned in the terms of field of historian studies about Ukraine that there is European historians, US, Canadian historians, and also perhaps several generations of Ukrainian historians. What effects, so we have different schools, perhaps beyond this regional region of these historians. So what effects these current events in Ukraine brought to these schools? Do we have also perhaps new schools of Ukrainian historian studies? So can you map up the landscape?
Well, one thing that is happening, and we already discussed that with Michael, so here you see two representatives of rebels against the national paradigm who don't subscribe still to the traditional understanding of national history, but somehow felt that they have to rethink and rewrite their articles. So clearly there is, it's a clear impact of what is going on in the region, and this is, I think, is a broader phenomenon. When it comes to Ukraine, this is a society at war. This is a society at war, frankly, I'm not encouraging that, but I am surprised that the level of this othering and nationalism is reached certainly higher than it was before, but it certainly didn't reach the levels that normally, let's say it that way, happen in the countries that are in the middle of the war and struggle. But generally there are, so certainly I mentioned Kiev and Rus, there are the lines are drawn much clearer. Again, we are, all of us, we kind of live in our own bubbles in terms of people with whom we communicate, normally people who, on a certain level, share our ideas. Then we get absolutely shocked that someone like Trump can be elected because all our friends would never vote for Trump. And the same happens with the historians. We talk to like-minded people, and like-minded in Ukraine, I see the same kind of changes happening there. So it's less geographically defined, Europe versus North America. My very impressionistic impressions about the rest of the field, and especially public history. I was in Lviv at the Ukrainian the book publishers forum, where they presented the Ukrainian translation of my history of Ukraine, and I kind of more politely, but I asked the publishers, "What is wrong with you? Why are you doing that?" There are a lot of histories out there. But when they approached me, I thought that they wanted to translate The Last Empire, but they went with this. That was a surprise. And the explanation that I got from the publisher was that, first of all, there is a hunger, enormous hunger for the books on history, so that the commercial publishers, without subsidy, this is one of my first books where I'm not coming with money and begging, please publish me or something like that, think that there is a market out there. So there is a thirst for history. And at the end, they said that they actually wanted something like a matrix or something like that, where they can put, or the reader or their reader can put this different pieces of knowledge that is there and the books that they're reading. And that was the motivation for translating of my book. Again, why I'm saying that, it's not to say once again about my book, but about what I learned in terms of generally what is happening there. There is a huge demand for history and rethinking of history. And another thing, again, what I noticed in terms of online commentary and things like that, there is cracks emerging in that unified front that was in 2014, that really saved Ukraine in 2014, with the liberal camp and more nationalist-minded camp really taking different positions on history. And again, that's not completely unexpected. We can certainly explain that in many ways, but in terms of the unity of that common front, it is certainly in danger at this point. Judging by what I can understand from the public reaction to works of history published in Ukraine. Again, very impressionistic. We would need a good sociologist, a good anthropologist, a good political scientist to go there and research that, and maybe you already shared results of your research here before.
So the future of the past in Ukraine is a hot topic.
It is, and it is bright.
Great. Well, we're right at time. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Seri Plokhy.